Some people don't feel lonely in crowds. They feel lonely after the crowd is gone. There's a relief that comes with being by yourself that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it. The quiet doesn't feel empty at first. It feels clean. Like your nervous system finally has room to stretch. Nothing is demanding your attention. No one is reading your face. You don't have to react at the right speed or say the right thing. You can just exist at your natural pace. And for a while, that feels like peace. But then there's a moment, often much later, when the calm shifts. Not into sadness, into awareness. You notice the silence has weight now, that the stillness you needed is the same stillness reminding you no one is here. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to register. It can be confusing to hold both truths at once. To feel grounded by solitude and unsettled by it. To choose aloneness freely and still feel the faint outline of loneliness pressing in at the edges. People who live like this often don't talk about it, because it sounds contradictory. Because it's hard to explain how being alone can feel like safety and still not feel like enough. It's not that you don't like people, and it's not that you can't be alone. It's that silence, when it lasts too long, starts to echo. There's a particular kind of hurt that comes from being told your loneliness doesn't make sense. It's quiet, almost embarrassing. When you say you feel alone and someone responds with, "But you like being alone," something closes a little, as if comfort in solitude cancels out the ache that sometimes follows it. As if enjoying your own company disqualifies you from missing anyone else. People like this hear variations of the same message over time. You have friends. You seem fine. You're independent. You always need space. None of those are untrue, and none of them touch the part that feels unseen. What often gets missed is that solitude and loneliness don't sit on the same line. They're not opposite ends of one scale. They're different experiences that can exist in the same body, sometimes on the same evening. The loneliness here isn't loud. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't always want company right now. It just wants to be acknowledged as real. When that isn't allowed, the feeling turns inward. It starts to sound like self-doubt. Like maybe you forfeited the right to feel this by choosing quiet. Those who've lived this recognize the pattern. The way your inner world feels rich and steady, yet oddly unshared. Like carrying something meaningful with no obvious place to set it down. It can feel like standing in a warm room while being told you shouldn't notice the cold near the floor. The warmth is real, so is the chill. Nothing here is exaggerated. Nothing is wrong. This is simply a kind of pain that doesn't announce itself loudly enough for others to recognize. After a while, the misunderstanding doesn't just stay outside. It moves inward. It starts to sound like a private accusation you carry quietly. If being alone feels natural to you, it's easy to wonder whether that comfort is a flaw. Whether ease in solitude means distance, or coldness, or some quiet inability to connect the way others seem to. People like this often learn to scan themselves for what's missing, why they don't reach out more, why crowds feel heavy instead of energizing, why needing space sometimes comes with guilt, as if rest itself requires justification. The shame here doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives as comparison, as the sense that you're misaligned with how connection is supposed to look. Psychologists sometimes talk about temperament, but what it feels like is this. Your system calms in quiet, not noise. Your attention sharpens when stimulation lowers. Your sense of self becomes clearer when nothing is pulling at it. That isn't withdrawal, it's regulation. For some people, closeness has always required more processing, more emotional bandwidth, more recovery afterward. Not because they don't care, but because they feel deeply, and depth has weight. When a culture rewards constant sociability, preference for solitude can get mislabeled. What is actually sensitivity gets called distance. What is selectiveness gets called avoidance. Over time, it can feel like carrying a perfectly functional tool and being told it's broken simply because it isn't loud. Those who've lived this recognize the relief that comes when the shame loosens even slightly. When the story shifts from "something is wrong with me" to "this is how my inner world stays intact." Nothing here needs to be defended. Your way of being didn't appear by accident. It formed as a way to stay steady, present, and whole in a world that often moves too fast. That isn't failure. It's adaptation, misunderstood. The experience itself usually comes before the explanation. Long before anyone has language for it, there's just the felt contrast. How being alone can settle your body, while feeling alone can quietly unsettle it. These two states often get confused, even though they do very different things inside you. Solitude, for people like this, tends to be restorative. The nervous system downshifts, breathing slows, thoughts line up instead of competing. It's not withdrawal so much as recalibration, like turning down background noise so something internal can come back into focus. Loneliness works differently. It doesn't always show up as sadness. Often it arrives as tension, a low-grade alertness, a sense that something relational is missing, even if nothing is immediately wrong. Psychologists describe loneliness as a social hunger signal, but what it feels like is your system staying slightly on guard. Not panicked, just awake in a way that doesn't fully rest. For people whose nervous systems are more sensitive, this contrast can be sharper. Quiet regulates them. Too much stimulation overwhelms them. Yet prolonged disconnection still registers as absence. This is where the paradox forms. The same person can crave space and still ache for closeness. Not at the same intensity, not in the same moment, but within the same inner landscape. Introversion is often mentioned here, but it's only part of the picture. Introversion simply means energy is restored internally rather than socially. It doesn't erase the need for attachment. It just changes the conditions under which connection feels safe and sustainable. Attachment patterns add another layer. Some people learned early, without anyone being at fault, that closeness came with complexity. That connection required vigilance. That needing others sometimes meant losing steadiness. Psychologists might call this avoidant or fearful avoidant attachment. But what it feels like is wanting connection that doesn't cost your nervous system its balance. Wanting closeness that doesn't require self-abandonment. So space becomes a form of safety, not because others are unwanted, but because regulation matters. Over time, this can shape how loneliness is experienced. Instead of pushing outward, it stays contained. Instead of demanding company, it waits quietly. It shows up as a dull ache rather than a sharp pain. Those who've lived this recognize how confusing it can be to explain, to feel deeply relational, yet selective, to value connection, yet need distance to stay present within it. Nothing here points to something broken. It describes a system that learned how to stay balanced in its own way. A system that knows how to calm itself, but still remembers that humans are not meant to be entirely self-contained. Solitude restores, loneliness signals. For some people, both speak at once. Understanding this doesn't make the feeling disappear, but it softens the internal conflict. It allows the experience to make sense without turning into self-judgment. What once felt like contradiction begins to feel more like complexity. When someone spends a lot of time alone, it's easy to assume that nothing much is happening there, that solitude is empty space, idle time. But for people like this, being alone is rarely passive. It's where a lot of quiet work has already been done. Long stretches of solitude tend to train the nervous system. You learn how to settle yourself without external cues, how to sit with emotion without immediately needing to discharge it, how to notice internal shifts before they become overwhelming. This isn't something that announces itself as a skill. It just shows up as steadiness. People who are comfortable alone often develop a precise awareness of their inner world. They can feel small changes in mood. They recognize when something is off before it turns into something loud. Not because they're overly focused on themselves, but because silence leaves fewer distractions. Psychological research often notes that people who tolerate solitude well tend to show lower baseline neuroticism and higher openness to experience. But what that feels like day to day is an ability to let thoughts move through without panicking at their presence. A willingness to explore ideas, emotions, and memories without immediately needing to escape them. Creativity often grows here too. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind that emerges when the mind has room to wander without being interrupted. Connections form slowly. Meaning settles in without being forced. There's also a depth of empathy that develops in these spaces. Spending time alone doesn't make someone less attuned to others. Often it sharpens perception. You learn to read subtle shifts, to notice what isn't being said, because you've spent so much time listening inwardly. Resilience, too, tends to build quietly. When you've learned how to be with yourself through boredom, sadness, and uncertainty, you don't collapse when external stimulation falls away. You know how to keep yourself company. You know how to stay present when things are unresolved. From the outside, this can look like detachment. But from the inside, it's often a carefully cultivated inner ecosystem. Those who've lived this recognize that their solitude wasn't an absence of growth. It was the environment where growth could happen without pressure, like soil that looks still on the surface, but is doing essential work underneath. None of these capacities were formed because someone was trying to become strong. They formed because this was how the system learned to stay balanced. What once looked like a lack begins to look more like quiet competence. Not flashy, not performative, but deeply functional. The inner world here isn't empty, it's furnished. In relationships, this inner pattern often becomes visible without anyone naming it. It shows up in rhythm, in how closeness is approached, then gently retreated from. People like this usually don't avoid connection. They approach it carefully. They move toward depth, then step back to breathe. Not because something went wrong, but because too much closeness at once can blur the edges of the self. From the outside, this can look confusing. Someone may feel deeply connected, then suddenly quieter. Present, then needing space. The shift isn't about interest fading. It's about regulation returning. Those who've lived this know how hard it can be to explain without sounding distant or inconsistent. How stepping back is often misread as pulling away. How silence can be interpreted as rejection when it's actually a form of self-preservation. This pattern tends to value quality over frequency. Long conversations that linger, shared understanding that doesn't need constant maintenance. Connection that feels meaningful, even if it's not continuous. In friendships, this can mean deep bonds that don't rely on daily contact. In romantic relationships, it can surface as a quiet push and pull. Not a game, not manipulation. just a system that needs closeness and space in alternating measures. Psychologists sometimes describe this as fear of engulfment, but what it feels like is losing clarity when there's no room to retreat. The self becomes fuzzy, emotions tangle, distance restores outline. Work and family settings can amplify this tension. Obligatory closeness without chosen intimacy can feel especially draining. Not because others are unwelcome, but because the connection lacks depth or consent. Over time, misunderstandings can accumulate. Others may assume disinterest or emotional unavailability. Meanwhile, the internal experience remains one of care, attention, and often quiet loyalty. Those who recognize themselves here often carry a private grief, not for relationships they didn't want, but for how often their way of connecting was misinterpreted. Nothing in this pattern points to a lack of capacity for love. It points to a need for relational space that allows presence to remain genuine. Closeness, for people like this, isn't about constant proximity. It's about being able to return to connection without losing oneself in the process. At some point, patterns start to harden into labels. Quiet becomes distant. Selective becomes difficult. Needing space becomes someone who struggles with people. When those words repeat long enough, they begin to feel like identity instead of description. As if the way you manage your inner world is who you are, rather than something you do. But people like this are not defined by solitude. They move in and out of it. They return to it the way others return to conversation, or noise, or activity. Not to disappear, but to come back to themselves. What often gets missed is that the preference for aloneness isn't the whole story. It's one environment within a larger inner life, a place where clarity restores itself, where emotions settle into their natural shape. Psychologists might talk about coping patterns, but what it feels like is knowing where you can breathe, knowing which conditions allow you to stay intact. This isn't a social failure in disguise. It's a different orientation toward meaning, toward connection that feels deliberate rather than constant. People wired this way tend to experience identity from the inside out. They need coherence before expression, alignment before exposure. Their sense of self isn't built through frequent interaction, but through reflection, integration, and careful presence. Over time, it can become easy to confuse this with being stuck, as if returning inward means avoiding life. But returning isn't the same as retreating. Those who've lived this recognize the difference. Solitude isn't where they disappear. It's where they gather themselves so they can show up without distortion. The paradox doesn't need to be resolved to be understood. Liking to be alone and still wanting connection can coexist without canceling each other out. They describe a person who values depth over display. When identity loosens from old labels, something quiet shifts. Not confidence, not certainty, just relief. The sense that your way of being was never a problem to solve. It was a rhythm to understand. Over time, the experience doesn't need to be solved to feel lighter. It only needs room to breathe. For people like this, life often moves in rhythms rather than resolutions. Periods of closeness, periods of quiet. Not as opposites, but as parts of the same cycle. Solitude doesn't have to mean disconnection, and connection doesn't have to require disappearance of the self. Both can exist without canceling each other out. Hope here isn't about becoming different. It's about becoming less divided inside, about allowing your internal seasons to change without treating any one of them as a mistake. Those who've lived this recognize the calm that comes from no longer arguing with their own nature. from letting solitude be a place of return rather than a place of exile, from trusting that meaningful connection doesn't vanish just because it isn't constant. Nothing dramatic needs to happen next. No new version of you needs to arrive. There is simply the quiet possibility that your way of moving through the world already contains both steadiness and longing, and that holding them together gently is enough for now.